A traditional auto bomber build was a simple, fun experience, building around Herald of Ice and Thunder to forcibly explode the enemies around us while walking peacefully through a map. A build playstyle I used to love quite fondly. You'd use Herald of Thunder, it'd proc Herald of Ice, that would chain off and destroy the enemies around you. It was magnificent. But the past few days, I've been reassessing why I haven't built one of these characters in years. And the answer I found couldn't be clearer. Their skills balance around a different game, simply put. They were introduced in 1.2, back when PoE had two separate league mechanics for softcore and hardcore gamers, when Act 4 didn't even exist yet, and our Forsaken Masters hadn't betrayed us. And since then, the amount of balance they have received to this point has been essentially non-existent. Thus I say they were balanced around a different game because, let's be honest, 1.2 is a hell of a lot different than 3.19. Now, for a while these skills survived simply due to a few edge cases of overpowered items / interactions thanks to player creativity that just made it work. Which, those systems and those overpowered interactions have been systematically eliminated over the years as the game has gotten progressively harder. Now, as a Herald enjoyer myself, I am making this video in hopes someone at GGG might see this and consider giving what has to be some of the best skills they've ever added to the core game a balance pass. There isn't a skill in the game that sells more MTX than Heralds do. Change my mind. They have like 15 MTXs for one skill. That doesn't come on any other skill in the game as far as I can tell. It is only financially prudent to consider giving these skills some love, because I remember a time when I chose to use these skills not only for the fun aesthetics, but because they could be an actually viably fun build to play. And now in the current game, I can, in almost every build I make, only justify these skills for aesthetic purposes only, and nothing more, because they just aren't good. Now here is my case for why Heralds are in desperate need of buffs in the current game. To start things off, they can't scale based on increases or reductions to spell or attack damage. This is very confusing, but basically what it means is the only way you can scale the damage of these skills is by percent damage, percent LE damage, percent cold or lightning damage, specifically for Herald of Ice or Thunder respectively. And that's really, really hard to do in most cases. It's also very confusing considering Herald of Ice has a spell tag. This is a confusing thing that I get questions on all the time for things like Righteous Fire. It doesn't make sense. It's counterintuitive. A new player is never going to understand why their percent spell damage isn't scaling this skill. It just doesn't really make sense. And it makes it incredibly hard to scale the damage of this skill, and frankly shouldn't be the case in the current game. Now on to my second point. These skills have 0% base crit. That means you have to get percent base crit to even get these skills to start actually scaling based on crit, which is a horribly big downside, especially considering even if you wanted to go non-crit, you wanted to go elemental overload, well guess what, buddy? You still have to scale into crit to get elemental overload to even proc. This, mixed with the fact that the skill starts out with 300 or 400 base damage, it's very, very hard to scale damage on this. Just looking at, I don't know, Frostbolt, for example, a skill you would expect to be able to like one-hit a monster with. This skill has something like, I don't know, 5 times the damage of Herald of Ice. And so say you get an enemy to die and you get to them to blow up with Herald of Ice, the likelihood that that Herald of Ice is going to kill the next enemy and then chain explode is virtually non-existent unless you have a ridiculous amount of scaling, and it's hard to get the scaling because it doesn't scale off percent damage. It doesn't really scale off crit well because you have to invest so much into it. By the time you've invested into crit, you don't have much percent scaling on the build, and it's still not going to one-hit things. And then to top the cherry off on all of this is what I'm saying is you also have very bad support gem choices. I would challenge you, the viewer, to go look at the Herald skills and try to get support gems that work and operate well with these skills. You're going to have a hard time doing it, especially if you're not going to go crit, because those are some of the only 2 support gems that actually are decent for these skills to begin with. Trust me, I've looked. There's not a lot of good options out there. Generally, there's some problems that come with the support gem choices you have. And not only that, there's also the issue of the area of effect of these skills. Let me just give you a quick little, example, I should say, of what the area is for Herald of Ice at a base. Its base radius is 12. If you want this to chain explode and kill other monsters within a pack, if it's not a super dense pack, the likelihood of it chain exploding is virtually non-existent unless you have a lot of AoE scaling. Now my example would be is if you add something like 200% increased area of effect, a ridiculous amount of investment to get this amount of AoE, I will say. you're looking at a 20 base radius. This is the radius at which you can start to expect maybe a chain explosion through a pack, but to get that amount of radius, that amount of increased area of effect, you're investing a lot into area of effect. And not only that, you're investing into a character that initially has 0 base crit and doesn't scale off of percent damage scalars like most other things do. And you start to have a build where just to get it to have enough AoE, just to get it to have crit, just to get it to have percent damage scaling, guess what? You haven't put any of your passives into anything else on the tree, and you don't have a real build. You have a build that is paper. On top of that, if you wanted to do a traditional auto bomber, if you wanted to do Herald of Thunder and Herald of Ice, you have the struggle for reservation space. You have the struggle for scaling both base lightning and base cold damage, because part of scaling these skills, if you want to get percent damage on it, you have to get percent lightning or percent cold, and that's some of the access points you would have to those scaling metrics. But once you start scaling to percent cold, all of a sudden you're not scaling your Herald of Thunder, and there's awkwardness to that as well. And my last point would be the only real viable playstyle of auto bombing we have that exists right now is just Herald of Thunder by itself, getting carried by gimmick items like Storm Secret and like Lone Messenger. But these items carry massive downsides. Basically, to get Herald of Thunder to do any respectable amount of damage, you essentially need 2 Storm Secrets and you need a Lone Messenger. But these things come with significant downsides. One being, you don't have auras anymore. The primary location you can get defenses in a build, it's auras. Without auras, you're not getting really good defenses without some significant investments elsewhere. But keep in mind, if you're trying to make Herald of Thunder do damage, you're investing into base crit, you're investing into percent damage scaling, you're investing into all these sorts of things. You're going to have a hard time investing into getting defenses on your tree, and you're not getting defenses from your auras, I can tell you that right now, because you're using Lone Messenger. On top of that, there's also the downside where Lone Messenger also makes it so you can only have 1 Herald. So even if you wanted to build into an auto bomber or build into Heralds, Lone Messenger, the one thing that gives some amount of support to Herald builds, says, you can only use 1 of them. You can only have fun with 1 of your Herald skills. This is the sort of scaling, like, this is by default, this scaling should be on Herald skills, and this shouldn't exist sort of situation. And Herald skills would still be kind of bad, in my opinion. So this has huge downsides, and on top of it, this also has the opportunity cost of having 2 rings that have no stats on it that also make you deal self-damage, which is a pretty significant downside. If you've played with this item, this adds up when you start hitting enemies 10 times a second with 500 damage a second. It's still a significant amount of damage to yourself. On top of that, if you wanted to look at builds that use Lone Messenger or use Herald of Thunder, you go through every single one of these builds, they're all paper. They can't afford defenses. You can check for yourself. You can do the research. These builds 100% get one shot all day, every day in a T16 map with no mods on it. Frankly, they probably get one shot in yellow maps, okay? You can't get defenses if you want Herald of Thunder to do damage, which frankly is a feels bad environment. The fact you have to fix the skill to make it viable by picking up such massive downsides is really, really quite sad for a skill that used to be so fun to build around. Obviously, in the current game, it's gotten much, much harder, and you need these sorts of things to even make the skill do damage to enemies. But on top of that, it just doesn't work. So, my simple suggestions are, if you're going to make Heralds a fun skill to build around again, because they really are probably some of the best, most interesting skills in PoE, they need to be able to do viable damage numbers. They need to be able to scale like normal skills, like scale off percent spell damage, so you could scale into both Herald of Thunder and Herald of Ice at the same time. They need to have buffs to having actual base crit like regular skills have. It's kind of ridiculous they don't. Their base numbers probably need to be significantly higher. By default, Herald of Thunder should work like it does without using Storm Secret. Storm Secret and Lone Messenger, those items shouldn't really exist, in my opinion. Herald of Thunder should just work as if it had those items on by default. You shouldn't have to... The scenario where you have to basically use gimmick items to fix a skill to make the skill not bad just means, hey, maybe there's something wrong with your skill. Maybe the skill should work without those items and be a cool skill to use on its own, and then people build around it. Not a skill that until you put these items on, it doesn't work at all. That showcases, hey, there's an issue here with these sorts of skills. I'm mostly just making this video because auto bombers have a special place in my heart. I knew I used to make them and try to force them to work, but over the years they've become so weak and so just underpowered in the current game. These are skills that I think are worth the time and investment to put into to try to make them viable again, because unlike Heavy Strike, you're never really going to make Heavy Strike a fun skill. This, Herald of Thunder, Herald of Ice, these are fun skills. They have cool interactions, they have passive benefits that make cool things happen on the screen. These bring fun to players. Heavy Strike, probably not worth the time investment. Herald of Thunder, Herald of Ice, these things deserve some love, and if you buff these things, you make them interesting, a lot of people are going to have a lot of fun playing with them, and quite frankly, you're going to sell a hell of a lot of MTX. These things have the most financial incentive out of any skills in the game to invest into MTX. You might as well make them good. I'm just trying to appeal to as many arguments as I can here that maybe somebody at GGG sees this video and thinks, yeah, we should buff Herald of Ice, Herald of Thunder. Now I'm going to close this video out with just basically going over the character I made, because I was in what's the word, denial of how bad these skills were. Well, not completely denial. I mostly was putting this together, and you could ask my friend Theros. Even while I was putting this character together, I was on Discord chat with him, and I was basically saying, I know going into this character's gonna suck. I'm gonna do it anyways. And the footage you saw today was basically me running like T15s or T14s, and it's with a character that has relatively strong gear, I would say, but it's just a bad build. I guess you would think a character that has like a 9-link, 8-link helmet, whatever this is, for Herald of Ice would be able to viably do content consistently, but if you saw in that footage, you saw a lot of enemies were being left alive, you know. And I was also struggling with the issue of my support gem choices they're just not very good. I was struggling to choose support gems that made sense. I was stretching my tree really thin to try to make crit work to get base crit, and so I had to use a lot of clusters, which leaves me very little room for passes on my tree. There was a lot of basically me pulling in different directions to try to get this work. I figured maybe I could get some single target out of Triumvirate Ring if I did like a Val Storm call, but even that wasn't really enough to fix the damage to make the build viable. Ultimately, probably there's significant mistakes I made with this build, but it's just something I wanted to do, something I wanted to try to make work, because I do like Herald builds. It's been one of my favorite basically archetypes of builds, the traditional auto bomber, Herald of Thunder, Herald of Ice, using these in combination, having cool explosions, walking around, and it isn't really a build anymore, as far as I can tell. And I think I'm decent enough at PoE. I think I gave it a good shot, and I severely struggled to make it do any relevant damage. I'll leave the PoE below so you can make your own judgments on that, but as always, I hope you enjoyed the video. This is just basically a video I'm making because I'm hopeful that maybe in the future we could see some buffs to Herald of Thunder and Herald of Ice. It's a little bit weird they haven't had any adjustments since pretty much their creation into the game, so it'd be cool if we got some buffs to them. Probably not going to happen, but, you know, a guy can dream. Anyways, take care, Exiles. Have a good one.